Global Governance Futures is brought to you from the Global Governance Institute at University College London. This is a podcast about the challenges facing humanity and possible global responses. How does the world hang together? What has gone wrong? And what has global governance got to do with it? To learn more, please visit ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.
In today's podcast, we're joined by acclaimed science fiction author Tim Maughan to discuss the intersection of technology, society, and future visions of technological dystopia. Our point of departure for this conversation is Tim's recent novel, Infinite Detail, where he explores the impact of surveillance technology and the fallout of a future collapse of our digital infrastructures. Tim challenges us to think critically about the technologies we embrace and the future we are building. In surveying the landscape of modern technology, from smart cities to the Metaverse, he stresses the need for engaged citizens to recognize and to resist market-driven narratives that push for technological solutions to the deep-rooted political and societal problems that we face today. Ultimately, Tim's work is testament to the power of speculative fiction to hold a mirror up to society, exposing some uncomfortable truths along the way, while also challenging the prevailing orthodoxies of our times.
You don't fix social and political problems with technology. You don't fix social and political problems. Let me rephrase that. You don't fix social and political problems by pretending they're technological problems and then coming up with a solution for them. And that has been Silicon Valley's business model for the last 20 plus years.
This is Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. Tim Maughan is a writer using both fiction and non-fiction to explore issues around culture, technology, and the future. His debut novel, Infinite Detail, was published in 2019. We spoke with him in May 2024. Okay, brilliant. Well, I'm super excited to have you here with us, Tim. I've read Infinite Detail recently. I've also been following your journalistic work, which is also fascinating. I've become a huge fan of science fiction, actually, in recent years, not so much in my teen years. But,
right.
I've really found science fiction has become this huge resource for me in terms of expanding my horizons. People like, Philip K. Dick, and Frank Herbert, Kim Stanley Robinson, William Gibson, of course, who I understand is an inspiration to yourself. I found a lot of this realm, this imaginary realm, so helpful in terms of trying to counter this notion that, to use Mark Fisher's famous phrase, the future is cancelled. And I was really excited to discover British science fiction. So I read Maughan a couple of years ago by Nick Harkaway, and then I stumbled across your brilliant book, Infinite Detail, which I think is really in the best tradition of kind of socially relevant science fiction, really holding up a mirror to our contemporary society, where we might be going. And it's a pretty wild sort of visionary ride set in a near dystopian future, really sort of grappling with the consequences of global digital collapse, and especially getting into these kind of deep undercurrents, also meta currents around the relationship between humanity and technology. It's contextually very rich. I've been at that lay-by station on the M4. It constructs a world which is very believable, and I think very reflective of, at times, our reality. I did get some quite distinctly uncanny valley vibes, which was quite disconcerting. So I think we have lots to discuss, but perhaps we can begin by you just framing, why did you call the book Infinite Detail? What inspired that title? How does it reflect or capture the core themes of the novel?
Thanks, Tom. I just got a comment. You mentioned Mark Fisher there, and he was like a huge influence on me. And unfortunately, I probably kind of agree with his statement on that the future's been cancelled. That statement in itself was kind of a driver behind the book, or certain aspects of the book in a lot of ways. His work around ontology and this kind of how we find ourselves mourning, I guess is the proper word, kind of past social movements that we felt were going to be transformative was a big driver for the book for me, especially. About the title, So the title, I have a strange, I don't know if it's a quirk, but I kind of like to play with style in my writing a little bit. And one of the things I like to do is repeat phrases and kind of motifs and stuff from work between works as well, often. And infinite detail. I don't know how you are with cursing on your podcast, but the phrase infinite detail had turned up a few times in previous short stories I'd written, set in the same kind of universe. I don't like the term universe for literature particularly, but like the same kind of setting as infinite as the novel, and it was usually infinite effing detail, and that was kind of a phrase that was repeated in the narrative and sometimes by characters to refer to that kind of overwhelming kind of dump of information that we're presented with by the internet, right? And partly that one half to kind of capture that media overload that's been a kind of theme in science fiction, I guess, since you mentioned William Gibson as well, since going back to like Neuromancer and stuff. It's a theme that really has always fascinated me, and one that I thought was incredibly science fictional. The idea that we're so bombarded with content, as we call it now, like all the time from different directions, but also at the same time, the phrase, and maybe in the novel it means more this other meaning, that the amount of information about us that is extracted, that is mined, and turned into a resource um, by large tech companies and the internet itself and the surveillance capitalism, for want of a better term, that we are kind of subjugated to at all times. And it's like fascinating to me that it's really weird timing this morning for having this conversation, because I was just made aware this morning about Google bringing out well, they had a show a couple of days ago, a presentation a couple of days ago, and they showed a preview of a prototype, a new version of Google Glass, a new version of AR glass. It's very similar in some ways to the specs that are in the novel. These kind of headset these glasses-sized headset that you wear that has a head-up display and presents information to you, rather than a kind of augmented reality kind of thing. It's more HUD, like the original Google Glass was. And it's fascinating. Google Glass was launched, I think, in 2014, 2013, so 10 years ago now. And if people remember, and I'm not sure they do, which is kind of my point, but if people remember, there was a huge outrage towards it. The product failed because people were very uncomfortable of the concept of walking around a town or walking around a city or going into a bar and there being somebody there with a camera strapped to their face, which is in fact what it was, right? And the term glass holes was coined on social media and became media and kind of killed the product. Anybody using a device like this and non-consensually filming people in the street is a glass hole, was the term that's used. And it kind of killed the project. It's come back now. And they've announced it. I don't have the link. I'll dig it out and send it to you. They announced how it works. And they're pitching it very specifically as a platform for an AI assistant, their new AI assistant that they're working on. And Meta are doing the same thing with their smart glasses. But what's interesting about the language they used, what differentiates this device from other devices that is always on and it's always recording, and that it is constantly aware of your environment and making decisions and understanding context, in quotes, which I'm very skeptical about the environment you're in, so that when you ask it a question, it responds immediately rather than having to take a photo or take a video to front. And just very nonchalantly drop this into the description of the product. And I don't think anybody's going to be particularly upset by that. And by definition, this is a very small, lightweight product. If it ever comes out, it's a prototype, and Google are famous for not releasing products that they've prototyped. But like I say, Meta's working on a similar system. The only way it can do what it does is by taking that video and streaming it to a server. It can't do it locally. It has to be done in a data center. So they're advertising or they're promoting or speculating about a product that will, when worn, be constantly recording the environment and uploading it to their servers. And I don't think people are going to be outraged about that the same way they were about Google Glass 10 years ago, because I think we've just completely normalized that kind of non-consensual surveillance, right? That I literally, like, I live in Toronto, and I walk down to my like local stores and buy groceries every few days, and every time I will be videoed by somebody in the street. I'm not even talking about surveillance cameras. I'm talking about, people in the street making videos. I'm non-consensually in the back of them, or sometimes in the front of them, because people are recording the street for whatever content they're creating, and I've just walked through their shot, and no one has asked me for permission whether my face can be used. And that to me is still a really worrying problem. It's a really The connotations to it are huge. And we're only just now, I think, people like myself and a lot of other experts on this stuff, people who are experts, unlike me, on this stuff, have been worried and trying to talk about this for over a decade now. And we seem to just continuously normalized it. We seem to have not really pushed back on it. But now we're starting to see the implications of it even more. We've seen the implications of bias and stuff, but we're starting to see the implications in how it's been used to train AI and why they wanted this data for so long. And it feels like it's harder to resist now. But sorry, to come back to your question, sorry, a little off topic there, but so that was that kind of that meaning of that phrase as well, that these companies are collecting like this infinite detail about us, more information about us than we know, often about whether that's how we act online, how we browse, what we buy, how we shop, our viewing habits. All that stuff is this data exhaust that we can continuously produce is vacuumed up by them. And now, if these products want to throw kind of live real-time video streams into that mix as well, the title, I feel, is quite apt in a way.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So much to reflect on there.
Sorry, that was a bit of an info dump. I'm sorry.
No, it was good. That's a very rich context here, I think, for the conversation. But it made me, one thing I thought was, we're both probably old enough to remember the times before the internet, right? I mean, I remember going.
I certainly am, yeah.
Yeah, me too. I remember going to these internet cafes in 1994, 93, and doing the chat service and speaking with someone in Australia and just being like having my mind blown, And so there's a certain nostalgia, perhaps, to not necessarily to that world, but I think so 1997, 98, when I went to university, the internet was still kind of a Tim Berners-Lee paradigm, location. It still was sort of seen as a bit Wild West and very much sort of a public good, common heritage kind of a bit anarchic, a bit punk, perhaps. And so maybe not nostalgia, but the other term that came to mind was solastalgia, this idea of the sense of loss experience when one's environment undergoes significant change, which, having worked a lot in Latin America around mining sites, that's often where I think about solastalgia. But I wonder to what extent that actually applies also increasingly to this virtual landscape that we inhabit.
It's an interesting question. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I've been looking at nostalgia in various forms recently myself. And I have a friend, Grafton Tanner, who's an academic and philosopher in the US, who's written a couple of books on it. His last one was Foreverism, which is a fascinating book to read on this topic, and heartily recommend it. The book before that, I think, was called The Clock Has Lost Its Hours, which is about nostalgia. And he has an interesting take on that, about how in the last book, how we're kind of denied nostalgia now. He's come around to the point that it used to be something that we were marketed, but now we're kind of denied it. We're not allowed to be nostalgic about things, because to be nostalgic about something, it needs to have ended, it needs to have gone away, right? And then you can look back on it and with fond memories. But we're not allowed, if something is making money, if something is sellable, it's not allowed to end anymore, right? But Star Wars will never end, I'm nostalgic. I was nostalgic for the Star Wars I watched when I was 10 years old, but I can't be nostalgic for it now, because it will never end. It's constantly reinvented and resold to me and stuff. How that applies to what you're saying, I'm not sure. Yeah, there's a rate of transformation in the digital spaces that we're kind of um it's kind of hard for us to keep up with, certainly. I think there's a it's and this is again goes back to that Google Glass example that I mentioned. I think there's a case to be made that stuff was in previous eras of the internet, stuff was trialed by corporations and rejected both by users and the economy. And now they're just trying again with a lot of stuff. And like the other big example is you talking about that era, the mid to late 90s kind of era of the internet. And I'm a little older than you. I graduated university in 95. Yes, 95. 1995, I graduated university. That's when I first started using the internet, was at university. Um, and again, it was, like your Mosaic browser and Tim Berners-Lee and all that sort of stuff. It was very exciting. And we all learned HTML. I mean, not all of us, but some of us did. And I worked in the dot-com industry for a little while in the late 90s. And the thing that was being pushed, if people remember, very heavily in the late 90s, this concept of portals. So you would have one website that you went to that presented all the content from the internet for you in a smart way often, right? You would be able to pick your preferences. And the big sites for this were basically disappeared now. There's Alta Vista, which was a search engine, and Yahoo, which was a search engine. And ironically, what happened was these sites started out being quite simple to use. They were a search engine you went in, and as they tried to hook you into it being your homepage, the place you accessed the internet from, they got more and more complicated, and people went off them. And Google came along, and Google took over with two reasons. One, they were very, very good at search. Their algorithm was very, very powerful. And two, that you went to their website and it was literally just a search input. There was nothing that said Google and search, and you typed in when you want to search when you hit search, and people really like that simplicity. So that portal model really died, and Google kind of killed it off. But it's back, right? That's everybody wants to do that portal model now. That's what Facebook is. Facebook / Meta wants to be the front to the internet, right? Google's like that now. You can't, you go to the Google search engine and it's pushing a lot of other content to you. And again, the same with this Google Glass thing. I think that these companies have long memories for things that didn't work that they fundamentally believed in, and will try and bring them back. And it seems to be working to some extent. I know I don't use Facebook particularly. I use Meta products a lot because I'm quite into VR, so I'm forced to use Meta products in other ways. But I don't use like Facebook or Instagram particularly, but I know a lot of people do. So it's kind of like that portal model that caused the collapse of the dot-com economy, arguably in sort of 97, 98, has won and has kind of come back. It's kind of been used now. So this kind of transformation to digital spaces is a really odd one. And it can be a really depressing one as well, because less for nostalgic reasons and more that, like, if you're trying to push or get back against this stuff, you're trying to resist this stuff, or even just be critical of it, it can be very disheartening to find that stuff that you're worried about 10 years ago, we've gone back to that, or that we're having the same conversations. I like open up the Guardian some mornings and there's an op-ed on the front of the Guardian saying we should be worried about surveillance on the internet. And I'm like, we should, absolutely, and it's good, but it's really kind of disheartening for me that we're just, for some people, just starting this conversation now. Yeah, but that's maybe maybe that's a me problem in some sense, right? But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we should almost timestamp this conversation, right? Because events are moving so fast. I mean, we're on artificial intelligence. I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, that may not have featured in this conversation. Now, in some ways, it comes into the foreground. And indeed, people may not be too concerned about surveillance. This tension between convenience and privacy that, again, is a theme running throughout the novel. But artificial intelligence, I mean, I don't know. I mean, make what you will of it, but Tucker Carlson did say that we should nuke the data centers on Joe Rogan recently.
I had missed that. Did he actually say that? I should send him my book.
You should.
As a very bad joke, I would not do that.
But I mean, I think risk analysts are now saying that the data centers are a key sort of fragility within the digital infrastructure that needs to be paid attention to, as much as, say, nuclear power stations would have had to be secured in sort of an earlier epoch. Well, and continue to hopefully continue to be secured.
Hopefully, yeah. Let's hope.
But I suppose in terms of nostalgia, what I was sort of also driving at is this kind of, if we look at the role of Rushdie Manan, who's one of the key protagonists in the novel, this kind of hyper intelligent, very able coder who creates this kind of parallel society in Stoke Croft, in Bristol, which in a sense is an act of resistance against the kind of totalizing intrusion of the digital technological society all around. It reminded me a bit of sort of Václav Havel's idea of parallel polis, So obviously he was speaking about trying to resist a kind of a regime of occupation under Soviet rule. But I wonder whether there were some, we might draw on some of that history of activism within a totalitarian context, and we begin to sort of discern some dynamics along those lines here. I mean, this, in a way, the hope was that the internet might provide us with the tools by which to realize what we might call individual sovereignty or collective sovereignty. I don't know exactly what terminology you'd use, but it seems as if that hope has also sort of died on the vine.
Yeah, a little bit. I think the biggest problem we have, I kind of guess I was alluding to with what I was just saying earlier, is I don't know that people are aware of all the time of how bad things are. Like, I mean, if you live in a totalitarian society, it's kind of, I feel like it's kind of fairly obvious if you live, in the kind of sort of classical stereotype of totalitarian society, in a Soviet Union sense, or in a North Korean sense, you're living in one, right? But when you live in a kind of totalitarian neoliberal consumerist society, like arguably we possibly do, it's harder to push back on. It's hard to recognize that's where you are. It just feels like things sometimes don't work, right? Or things aren't working in your favor, or things feel unfair. But the removal of the displacement of that kind of surveillance to private industry makes it feel like it's not compulsory, it's not forced on you. I got this discussion a lot, especially I live in North America and I live in Canada now. But I lived in the US for a long time, and there's a sense there in discussions that people trust corporations more than they do governments. Absolutely, because you can opt out of a product or a service and avoid kind of surveillance or control, arguably, that these systems inflict on you. But I don't think that that's true, and I think that's increasingly not true. I don't think it's been true for a while. It just looks like it has the kind of illusion of consumer choice kind of feels like it's possibly for you to kind of opt out of these things, where of course it's not, right? We're on the Zoom call now. I can't remember how it was resolved, but for a while, it was, I think they said they weren't going to do it, but the Zoom were going to be analyzing all calls to train their AI, right? You know what I mean? And things like that. And I can't sign into certain websites for having a Google account. All this stuff, you are absolutely, your data is so valuable that it's impossible for you to opt out of these systems without maybe going offline completely. So yeah, it's interesting, and I like the idea of a kind of collective sovereignty rather than an individual sovereignty, but that's maybe the kind of the old school Marxist in me. I how you achieve that though is, well, that's really what the book's about in some sense, right? It's kind of a thought experiment. I hate the term thought experiment, but it's kind of like a playing with the idea of what works and what doesn't work and who you leave out and stuff. It's very easy for us to want to go and like, I talk all the time rhetorically and sometimes less rhetorically about blowing up data centers. I'm like, that gets to a point where, I mean, I've spent 10 years, people I know have spent 30 years trying to argue against this stuff, trying to push back against it. And at what point do we break and have to use direct action because of the environment, because of our own privacy, or because of terrible decisions that are being made, on the streets of US by predictive policing software, or on the streets of the Gaza Strip by, IDF target assessment software. What do we do to stop this if people won't listen to us? If our politicians don't seem to care about it, if companies don't listen to us? Like, at what point do we break into the data centers and at least throw paint on the servers, right? Do you know what I mean? That's something at some level. And I think what's worrying about it as well, I think the thing that the pandemic really, really, I think exposed to a lot of people, including myself, was how illiterate, not for want of a better word, how lacking in literacy people are about this stuff, right? So I think what you saw in the pandemic and the anti-masking stuff and the anti-vaxxing stuff, and especially the anti-5G stuff, which is still fascinating to me for kind of obvious reasons. With the explode of that, I think people don't on a daily basis, for very, very understandable reasons, don't on a daily basis interact with politics in a way that some of us do, and don't look and read and hear about how things work, about how things are changing, and about these issues, about any issues in some ways. Have filed that all under politics, which is something that is annoying and frustrating and exhausting, and they're right, because it is all of those things. And they've wrapped up in party politics, which is they see as, like a bullshit team sport, and they're right, it absolutely is. And as a result, don't have the language and the skills and the thought processes to interact when something happens. When something happens, they just look at the first thing they see that they think they understand and appeals to their personal emotions, and that's why we've got to go set fire to 5G towers. Do you know what I mean? Or we've got to go and protest against the government. We've got to go and not wear masks and all this stuff. And that, I think, is what is one of the most concerning things to me, is not just that people are unaware of these issues, but when they're presented with them, they don't know how to react to them, and then react in different ways. And that's not something I know an easy answer for. I'd like to believe that writing science fiction novels will fix this, but I don't know that it will, right, Jimmy?
Tim, I'd love to go into this a little bit more, like listening to you speak about resistance and sort of authoritarianism. It makes me want to ask you, I guess, about how you think technology is maybe changing the face of power. I mean, some of the more interesting articles that I've read while doing the masters have been about how in international politics, this sort of conception of power has shifted from being these sort of moments of concentration where policymakers and leaders maybe converge at a UN General Assembly or a NATO conference, and they sort of hammer out agreements and so forth, to actually a state in which it's the networks that connect these nodal points where really you see power being exerted, right? Whether it's on the internet, like we're talking about now, or telecommunication, supply chains, and so on and so forth. So how do you think, maybe if we focus on technology a little bit, these networks are changing power?
That's an excellent question, man. And it's something that I think about a lot. I spend a lot of time on this, especially when I was living in the US. I didn't realize until I moved to America quite, how can I put this politely, how little average Americans understand the concept of power. They really don't. It's not really explained to them. It's not really part of like the American ethos, the American dream, to sort of think about how power works, right? It's intrinsically connected to wealth in the US, but any criticism of the wealthy is seen as being anti-American, and that's kind of broken many people's relationship to power, I think, in the US. And I think that's increasingly common in like sort of neoliberal capitalist societies around the world, less so in Europe for now, but who knows? And so that kind of focus on individuality and wealth. I remember like suggesting I can't remember what it was, maybe online or something, suggesting that in the US they should pass a rule when you weren't able to run for office if you had a personal wealth of say over 2 million. And this was the most controversial statement I could have ever made. Of all the controversial statements I've ever made on social media, I think that was the most. That's ridiculous. Like, do you know what I mean? And it was fascinating to me. But I'd like to come back to a question about technology and networks. I think that reflects in that in a way, in that we're kind of sold the idea of democratization on the internet, which is a horribly misused term, but that you can democratize industries, practices, and give power to people just by giving them access to technology or giving them a voice. And it just feels deeply skeptical. I'm just deeply skeptical about that. You just have to go and look at who owns stuff. Simple as that. You just have to go and look at who owns the stuff. And then you realize that the power still resides in either government or more likely in the hands of billionaire tech barons. And you know, it feels increasingly like a feudal system that we live under in terms of who has access to technology, what we're given, what we're allowed to own, and what we're allowed to rent and use. And I think that's a big impact on this concept of networks and power as far as individuals are concerned. Like even the AI stuff, I see a lot of talk around this. I'm doing a lot of work at the moment around AI and art and generative content creation and stuff like that. And I'm constantly, people are telling me they're excited about this because it democratizes creating art and gives that power to people who don't have that power. But they're using systems that are very much owned by the same people. I mean, you know, like Sam Altman's a billionaire. Meta's AI system is supposedly very powerful from what I'm hearing. It's owned by Meta, it's owned by Zuckerberg. Like you know, the billionaires still have control of the tools. It's that, you know, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools kind of thing. It does feel a lot like that. And it feels also like the ways that this has manifested, the way of kind of ultimately failed. Like the Arab Spring was very exciting at the time, but ultimately ended up with authoritarian governments in a lot of places. Obama coming to power was very exciting, and how they used data and mobilized people online seemed exciting until you saw what his regime was unable to achieve, and the mistakes they made. And then we saw exactly the same infrastructure used by Trump. We saw the same infrastructure used by Brexit, by the Leave campaign in Brexit. They used the same data structures, used the same way of organizing people online to make radically different decisions. It's an interesting concept, and I want it to be more true. Do you know what I mean? And I kind of want us to say, yeah, we can organize online and do stuff. I've seen exceptions, and I talk about it in the book a little bit. I went on Black Lives Matter marches when I was in New York a bunch of times, and that was an organization, that was a movement that used the internet well, and that's a movement that used social media well. It was also genuinely a grassroots movement. I mean, maybe that's why it worked. That's exciting, but it feels like an exception, and I don't know that it had ever a lasting impact, which is the really depressing thing. When, you know, I don't want to hijack the conversation. We're talking about police brutality in America, but that's not a situation that's been fixed. And in fact, it was a situation that ended up with the cops rioting in 2020 and an authoritarian crackdown on protesters. So, yeah, it's tough. It's a tough question. I hope I've answered it. I hope I haven't kind of sort of dodged what you were
No,
asking.
definitely. I mean, the two things that pop into my mind there, the first is, I guess, the idea of inequality, and I'm skeptical of the idea that the winners and losers, you know, set up for society is actually that liberating. And I think tech plays a big role in exacerbating that, because the people who have more have access to more, and they can just continue gaining more by using that kind of technology. But in terms of, creating these modes of resistance online or in person, I think the extent to which that doesn't work or what limits that goes back to the first point you made about just being overwhelmed. It's like in
Yeah.
the moment when something is really important, you can use technology to catapult a movement forward. But simultaneously, technology online spaces are bombarding you with everything else. And it's hard for those uh, positive movements to keep pace. I'd love to know what you think about that as
Oh,
well.
absolutely. I agree. Absolutely. And how do you deal with that? Well, you filter stuff, right? You use services, or you join communities, or you curate your social media in a way that you don't see the stuff that you don't want to see, because it's the only way of dealing with it, right? So I can go on YouTube and just watch videos about, I don't know, drum bass and video games all day, because that's things I want to watch YouTube videos about. Because if you try and watch videos about video games, if you try to watch YouTube clips about video games, they will try and make you watch clips about Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan constantly. And that's two people that I absolutely make sure are never in my feed, right? Because I want to use YouTube to relax. I don't want to use YouTube to get more angry. And I think people feel that, and and I'm not really on Twitter anymore. I've still got an account, mainly because I don't want someone to take my name. But in the way it's gone in the last couple of years, I don't really want to be on there. But even when I was on there, I used to get exposed to terrible things on there, and it was really bad for my mental health. It's bad for your mental health, right? This is the thing. Like, getting overwhelmed is bad for your mental health. Getting overwhelmed by tragedy is also bad for your mental health, even when you need to see it. So we're in this kind of really awkward situation. I think you're exactly right. I think being overwhelmed and then trying to deal with that is what keeps us from realizing what's happening a lot of the time. Yeah, it's a good point.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. I was hoping that we could also discuss smart cities, since that is quite a big topic in your novel. You already mentioned, obviously, that even nowadays when we go to the grocery store, we are likely going to be filmed by something, and that is obviously taken to the extreme in your book, where you're even monitored to know when your can of Coke is being recycled. Um, so I was wondering, do you believe that in real life we still have the right balance between surveillance and having and the smartness of cities, or do you believe that we have already crossed this line that in this novel has been crossed?
Uh, it's an excellent question. Thanks for bringing that up. The smart city obsession of mine was very much a driver for writing the book in the first place, and I think we've already crossed the line, unfortunately. I'm trying to find a positive take on that, because I don't want to be that guy all the time. But it does feel to me like that we've kind of crossed that line. What's been interesting to me in the last few years is watching how you don't hear the term smart cities too much these days. I don't hear people saying it as often, which is always the case. We go through these hype cycles, it was smart cities, and then it was self-driving cars, and then it was the metaverse, and then it was now it's AI, and then it was crypto, and you know what I mean? And this is how the economy works now, right? This is how the markets work. They work through speculative meme stocks, right? And I saw someone today very cleverly describe Elon Musk as a human meme stock, and that is what his industry is. That's what he does for a career. He comes up with ideas and boosts the value of himself and his perceived brand value, and that makes money for him on the market. And people remember, like, a year ago, he did a announcement that he was building a humanoid robot, and he had a guy on stage in a costume of the robot. Do people remember that? That happened, and nobody really got upset about it. Like, nobody went, what the F? This guy's a clown and he's conning us. No, everybody was like, "Oh, Elon's building AI now," and this is how he works, right? This is how he gets away, and it's how a lot of the economy works. So I think that's partly why you don't hear until it moves on to the next thing. If you want a prediction on the next thing, it's going to be, I think they're going to try and give asteroid mining a second go. I think they're going to actually. I think they tried a few years ago and it wasn't really time for it. But I think in the next couple of years, when the hype around AI starts to die down and people stop using ChatGPT because OpenAI have had to start charging for it because they can't afford electricity to run it on the scale they need to. The next hype cycle will be we could get lithium from asteroids, and they'll be trying to get people to believe in that and invest in that, and then it will never happen. Sorry, but very off topic. My point is, I don't think you hear that phrase so much because of the hype cycle, but I don't think that. I think that the kind of overall kind of philosophy about being a centralized city, I think that's kind of faded as well. Which, ironically, in some ways, to me, was kind of one of the more interesting things about, and one of the more positive things about the smart city model was a kind of not necessarily super centralized, but some management of how city works. I don't see any management of cities anymore. I see property developers. That's what I see, right? I don't, especially here in Canada, in Toronto, which is famous for its property development. We went to visit some friends who lived outside GTA. People don't know Toronto. Sorry, I shouldn't assume people know Toronto. Toronto itself doesn't feel like a particularly big city if you're in the downtown core. It's only a few million people population, but the GTA is close to 28 million, 20 million, I believe. It's like London or LA. It's a huge sprawl of other little cities and towns that have been merged into it. Unlike London, it has no mass transit system at all, so you have to drive everywhere. And we hired a car and left to go and visit some friends yesterday, which we don't do that often. And it was like driving past new cities. I hadn't seen anything like it since I've been in China 10 years ago, and getting trains between cities and seeing in the middle of like lush green Chinese countryside, new cities being built from scratch, literally brand new towers being built. And the Chinese reason for doing that was their economic model. They build a city to build a product, right? They look at the market and say, right, okay, so there's a global demand for more umbrellas. Let's build a city that just makes umbrellas. And that's literally was their economic model for many years. Here, it's not centralized like that. It's property developers doing that. And the cities are being remolded by property developers. What's interesting is, though, going back to smart cities, is they are using the technology and the methods that were promised and prototyped by smart city advocates, very much so. I'm very convinced. I know some people who are doing research into this. For example, Amazon sells data, right? And Amazon was selling data in New York like 10 years ago about who had Prime accounts, and you could map that onto you could overlay on a map of, say, Brooklyn, where the highest concentrations of Amazon Prime accounts were, and that would show you the neighborhoods that were being slowly gentrified. So you knew. I was an unwitting gentrifier myself. Couldn't afford to live anywhere else in New York, but ended up living in Flatbush, East Flatbush in Brooklyn, which is traditionally like Caribbean, Jamaican neighborhood, Little Haiti it's sometimes called. And that area was rapidly getting gentrified by property developers. And I'm sure it's because they could look at a map and they could see uptake of broadband at the time, which was still, like in some areas of New York, uptake of broadband internet was quite slow, and they could see the uptake of Prime accounts. So you could see populations expanding into areas and gentrifying them. That's where you go and build a condo block. That's where you go and buy up property for cheap and push up rents. And that's kind of the death knell for a diverse neighborhood if that happens, right? And I think those systems are still being used. I think that technology and that approach for management is being used. It's not being done by cities. It's being done by property developers, done by banks, being done by tech companies even, who want to find where their populations are that they can sell products to. So yeah, does that answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah, so that is really interesting. And it reminds me of one sentence that also very much stuck with me when I read your book, which was the whole smart city idea is so top down. It's nothing more than a suite of products sold to cities by large companies. And so, yeah, I was wondering in this context, do you believe that smart cities could be improved, or like the current state of cities that we have, do you think they could be improved by taking into account what the people actually want, giving them more of a say, having more of a bottom-up approach, or do you believe that this is not really feasible in practice?
It's a good question. That's an excellent question. And I like to, my whole approach to this stuff in general across the board is you don't fix social and political problems with technology. You don't fix social and political problems. Let me rephrase that. You don't fix social and political problems by pretending they're technological problems and then coming up with a solution for them. And that has been Silicon Valley's business model for the last 20 plus years, right? That like you find a problem, you make it a technological problem, and then you sell a solution to it. And I think that was the big problem with the smart city approach. Yeah, certainly. There's issues there's so many different takes on this and so many interesting things. Adam Greenfield wrote some good stuff on this, like about 10 years ago, which is really fascinating. And, you know, he talks about cities being a series of conflicts. And I think he's right. What makes a large city is there are lots of different populations and lots of different interests competing with each other, in conflict with each other all the time. And that can be really healthy. It doesn't have to be divisive. It doesn't have to be problematic. It doesn't have to exploit people, or it can just be an interesting way of a city generating culture if it's handled well. A city is a series of problems, but they're also not problems that need solving, right? Do you know what I mean? And certainly not in a kind of like top-down managed kind of technocratic kind of way. I do think that there's a role for technology in analyzing cities. I think there's especially in things like traffic management and stuff like that. But I want that data to be very open, and I want that data to be, I say open, but maybe that's not the word. I want that data to be accessible and visible to people. I don't know that I want companies able to use it. Do you know what I mean? Then, like in the examples I just gave, I don't want, you know, people to use it to justify gentrification or to expand their property development plans. It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. I think we kind of almost have gone in the last 10 years. We've kind of almost gone the other way on the smart cities thing and kind of become increasingly libertarian and deregulated, which is away from central management. And like I say, just allowed. I'm talking very strictly from a North American perspective, because that's where I've spent the last 10 years. When I come back to Europe, though, I still see the same thing, but maybe to less extent. We've kind of used it as it's kind of, the property developers have free rein to model cities, it feels like, in North America. I mean, you have the 15-minute city thing, which is like, again, an old concept. I do look at that. In the past, I've done a lot of work for companies like Arup, and they've been talking about this stuff as a sustainable model for North European cities for a long time. And it really, as someone that doesn't drive a car, it really excites me. But to see that turned into conspiracy theory, similar to the way, you know, we were talking about 5G towers, is really disheartening and really shows how much that kind of libertarian approach to cities has taken hold in the US, or arguably has always been there. Yeah, but that quote from the book about being a suite of products, I think that is like a really important thing to remember. When we were talking about smart cities 10 years ago, it was companies like Cisco and IBM that were pumping money into this stuff. And it was because they'd saturated the markets for high-end enterprise networking hardware, primarily, right? You know, the kind of internet switch that you need to run a data center, they had at that point kind of saturated that market. There were data centers were being built, but not in the speed that they needed them to be built. So they could sell these kind of high-end systems. And so what do? You try and turn a city into a data center. You sell cities the concept that they need to be data centers and collect data. And then you have all this kind of very, very physical, very expensive enterprise grade hardware that you can sell to a municipal city instead of selling to corporations, because you've kind of exhausted that market. That's changed now. We are building more data centers than ever, apparently, at the moment, because this AI hype, and you know, that's a whole other issue about the environment and power consumption that we can talk about. But you know, so I think that their emphasis, IBM doesn't care about data, smart cities so much anymore, because it's got other places to sell its service to. Intel, Nvidia doesn't care about gamers or crypto anymore, because, you know, things move on. companies move on to different markets they can sell their products into, and this hype fades and disappears, right? And I think that's kind of one of the first things to remember whenever listening to these kind of claims or these kind of theories that are speculated and fed to us by marketing, I think.
Fascinating. Great. Okay. I do want to orientate the conversation a bit towards the future now. But obviously, to understand the future, we need to know how we arrived at the present. And I mean, one perhaps as a contextual question to that shift. One thing I noted in the book is that the motto of Stokes Croft, this kind of free resistance city within the heart of Bristol, is relentless optimism. And I also see some hat tips to Buckminster Fuller in this novel. So reference to the Dymaxion, for example. Buckminster Fuller has featured on this podcast. We had this fascinating conversation with Jonathan Keats, who, for my money, has written the definitive biography of Buckminster Fuller, who was one of the great tech rational visionaries of the 20th century, well known in America, completely unknown, it seems, outside America for some reason. And I was curious to ask, how have you encountered people who live by that motto? Was that an inspiration for this novel?
So as you walk into Stokes Croft from the Bear Pit, there is a sign. I haven't been back to Bristol for 6 or 7 years now, and I was meant to go just after the book came out, and then pandemic hit, and I haven't had a chance to be back. As you walk into Stokes Croft through the Bear Pit, which is this submerged underpass under a roundabout that I describe in the book, there used to be a mural. It was a 3-dimensional kind of carved out of wood thing that said Stokes Croft, relentless optimism, just there as you walked in, and that was kind of just too much of an easy thing to put into the book. Really, it just was perfect, and that neighborhood's fascinating, and in the ways that I describe in the book, it's a heavily gentrified, in some ways, part of what used to be traditionally of St. Paul's, which was traditionally like a Caribbean non-white working class kind of neighborhood, and has become this weird kind of like anarchist hippie hipster space, and also just straight up gentrified space over the last 20 years or so. And that term kind of, I think, was there to kind of represent that. It's also it had a big squat community, and that was the site of some kind of police raids and stuff while I was living there that spiraled into riots and all sorts of stuff, fights against Tesco's who wanted to build a store, and all sorts of stuff. So there's this kind of history of conflict between its population and outside forces, whether they're political or the police or commercial or whatever. It's an interesting phrase. Sorry, remind me of your question while you were asking me about that. Sorry.
Well, it's just the extent to which that still animates certain, shall we say, subcultures, communities of resistance. Is that an energy that you still encounter, even if perhaps you do not share it?
Yeah, I do occasionally encounter that, and when it's for the good reasons, I'm impressed. When it's for the bad reasons, it scares me. I encounter it more than anywhere in sort of tech bro spaces now. I encounter it with somewhat at the moment, because the work I'm doing, dismaying number of artists who are very optimistic about AI tech. Sorry to go back to that, but it's just in my mind at the moment. That worries me. It's good to be optimistic, but you also have to understand a history of critical thinking around this stuff, and just a history of how technology's actually been used and how its promises have shook out, to go back to where we talk about that hype cycles, etc., etc.
Which of course reminds me of Buckminster Fuller's famous phrase that humanity is making all the right technology for all of the wrong reasons.
So exactly. So yeah, sorry, that was what I wanted to come back to. My brain had forgotten Fuller there for a second. I'm fascinated by Buckminster Fuller, not to the extent that a lot of people are, but so it's interesting what you said. was aware of Buckminster Fuller before I moved to America, but he is a name that comes up in a lot of spaces that I used to inhabit, places I would talk, events I was at, people would quote him. And it was always fascinating to me because I think I made this point in the book. I think he avoided a lot of critical analysis simply by not having anything made. Do you know what I mean? Like people, so there's one. I live in Canada, in Montreal. The biggest Buckminster Fuller dome, right, which is on an island on Montreal. It's an interesting structure to go and see. There's a botanical garden underneath it and event spaces and stuff. It famously like nearly burnt to the ground, I think, in the 1980s. It's very, very dramatic images if you go and Google Buckminster Fuller Dome, Montreal Island, or something like that, of it on fire. And I think that was kind of, I was always fascinated as a student. I did a sociology degree, but I focused very heavily on postmodernism and postmodernity rather than postmodernism, and looking at architecture as part of that in a way. That was a long time ago. Please don't ask me complicated questions about it. My memory is not great. But one of the things that I was very interested in Le Corbusier as a result of that, right? I was kind of, and how horrendous he is, how horrible his legacy is seen for very good reasons a lot of the time, right? But I was kind of fascinated by his kind of late modernist approach to like what architecture could be and the kind of utilitarian approach to it, which always struck me as interesting if misguided. And I kind of think that like I always felt with the Fuller thing, it was easy for people to be excited about him because they hadn't had to deal with the fallout of stuff he built, because not much of his stuff got built, right? Do you know what I mean? Whereas, there's cities in India and Africa that have to deal with the fallout of living in Corbusier designed architecture. I mean, even, you could make the argument that Corbusier, that was it a factor on the brutalist housing projects in the UK, right? And the result, the social and economic impacts that people have to deal and live with that right through to Grenfell, right? And so that stuff, part of me, it's almost a project at the back of my head to write this kind of alternative history novel where Fuller has had the kind of the opportunities that Corbusier had to have things built and what that actually looked like. Gibson does it in Neuromancer. It's very hidden. The beauty of Gibson work is there's huge ideas hidden in a single throwaway sentence, and it's something I try to mimic because I think it's a wonderful thing to do in science fiction. But he talks about the sprawl, which is the urban cities, lots of American cities like Boston, through New York, I think, all merging into one big urban sprawl, which is almost what's happened, what GTA feels like here. Has there been an aborted project at some point in its past because of climate change to build Buckminster domes over the top of parts of the city, and then that's ran out of money, and there are these half-completed dome structures, kind of skeletal structures imposed over the city, which is like a fantastic image. And I kind of stole that for infinite detail, because there was actually, when I was living in Bristol, an urban renewal group, I think we're probably funded by property developers, I don't know, who floated the idea of what do we do with the bear pit? What do we do with the bear pit was always a problem. So like, for people who don't know Bristol or haven't read the book, it's a roundabout in the city centre, a traffic roundabout, but it has underpasses that go under all of the roads that link into the roundabout. And they also meet in the middle in this wide circular pit, which is usually its population is fairly transient. There's usually a lot of unhoused people and lots of drug users hanging out in there. But there's always constantly been times by the government, by the city council, to try and revitalize it and turn it into an event space, or to turn it into a pop-up farmers market, all these kind of very gentrified things. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. They have to coexist with people that in the population that uses that space for itself, because it's kind of, in my view, it's kind of their space. It's been historically their space. It's a space they've been able to reclaim from the city. So there was a movement. One of these movements was to build a dome over the top of it. Right? The idea that you would transform that part of Bristol into this futuristic kind of vision of the city by literally building a Bucky dome, geometric dome over the top of it, right? And it didn't happen. But I like the idea of it happening and then it getting blown up by a tank shell or whatever happens, right? Do you know what I mean? Because I was kind of, there's a real sense, especially the kind of property development boom and this kind of aggressive corporate gentrification of cities, that these structures are going to live forever. And I like the idea that they don't, and we don't really plan for the future. To come back to you talking about the future, I don't think cities really plan for the future in that sense. They just kind of in this kind of rolling libertarian free market where whatever happens, happens. And that worries me. That worries me more now than worrying about like a very centralized technological management in cities. In some ways, I'd almost want that more than what's happening now.
Yeah, I mean, if we don't subscribe to kind of relentless optimism, perhaps, another theme that particularly comes out in the novel towards the close is this kind of idea of radical realism. The collapse of the internet is not pretty. I mean, the consequences are violent. It's a real sort of social breakdown scenario. Thinking about sort of lines of flight into the future, and sort of bringing a more radical realist lens to bear. I mean, you've written that the modern world has finally become too complex for any of us to understand. And I'm also struck, in the earlier conversation around the fictional economy, if you will, and this idea of data being the new oil. To paraphrase Steve Keen, an economist at UCL, his striking phrase that an economy without energy is a statue. Labor without energy is a corpse. So, as you say, I mean, these sorts of much larger macro structural dynamics might suggest that all things eventually come to pass. And perhaps there is some redemption to be found there. So I suppose there's two parts to this question. One is, do you think collapse is inevitable? And what does post-collapse look like? Because, the end of the novel is, without giving anything away, is ambiguous and kind of open-ended. It's not post-collapse as cataclysm necessarily.
No. No. Do I think collapse is inevitable? Yes, and I think we're already in it. I think we're in a very slow motion collapse, and I think we have been for a while. And I think a lot of the terms we use to talk about collapse are maybe outdated. So there's a lot of discussion, for example, about civil war in the US, and part of me thinks that civil war is inevitable in the US, but also that it's already started and we don't know what it looks like, and that a civil war in the US is not like a civil war that we would, kind of arrogantly define a civil war in an African nation or in a post-Soviet Union nation, right? Do you know what I mean? A civil war doesn't need to look like that anymore. It can be as divisive as that and be more asymmetric in some ways, maybe, and battles could be fought in different places, but they can just still be as destructive, I think. So I think that I don't want to get into talking about civil war in the US too long, but that concept that things might be collapsing, but we don't know what they look like or what that feels like, or things are taken away from us and we don't realize until they're not there, or we don't even have recourse to them anymore. It's like you could take the example of health services, right? I mean, you could look at the state of the NHS in the UK, you could look at the state of health education here in Canada, and the things that are eroded rather than they collapse, but it doesn't stop them from not being there, right? And it doesn't stop those people reliant on them suffering. And I think that's a lot of what we're dealing with now on a broader scale. It's such a big issue. It's where to start. I mean, the big end is climate change to some extent, right? And none of it feels sustainable at the moment. I've talked a lot about data centers and power consumption and AI, but that's not a thing that's just magically going away. Geoengineering isn't going to fix this. carbon extraction from the atmosphere isn't going to fix the damage we've already done. But while we have this, a lot of us have this weird existential dread that eats away at us at the back. Or maybe I'm just talking to myself, but I think a lot of us have this kind of, this constant dread and fear about this. We can't do anything about it. It doesn't feel like we can do anything about it. It's happening. We have to put it in the back of our head because we've got to get up and make breakfast and go to work and do our studies and whatever it is, we have to feed our families and do whatever we have to do. So the collapse is just kind of ticking away slowly out of the back. I do a lot of work over the last few years. Most of my work has actually been in kind of private sector, and I do a lot of writing about futures for private clients. Quite often people come to me with a research they're doing on a futures, an organization or a corporation, and ask me to write fiction to illustrate the futures that they're trying to speculate about. And I've done a lot of work for World Health Organization, in fact, over the last couple of years, post-pandemic, about that stuff. And before that, a project for Arup about climate futures. And pre-pandemic, I would always be asked to write about the climate. And people come to me because they know what I write, how pessimistic I am, or how realistic in quotes I am, or whatever term you want to use. And they will say to me, like, I know you're going to be quite pessimistic about this, but is it possible for you to speculate about futures that are actually quite positive? Not saying that climate change doesn't happen, but that as a civilization, we find ways to be resilient and deal with it. And I'm like, yeah, sure. And that was an interesting project for me to do. And I've done variations on it a number of times. The idea, usually the catalyst kind of being, like, okay, so climate gets very bad, storms get very bad, we have a really bad year of it, wildfires are bad, a lot of people are subjected to it that weren't normally in Western countries. They lose power, they lose infrastructure, they lose lives, and they demand better, and they elect governments across the board that like will take this more seriously. And we don't stop climate change, but we change our societies to be more resilient to them by being more equitable, by not relying on individual infrastructure so much. We're relying more on communities, on mutual aid and blah 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 blah. And we worked with companies like Superflux in London and other places, like projects for IKEA, where we kind of speculate about how these futures could look if we reacted to the things that we know are coming down the line, if we reacted to them in a certain way. And I just don't feel that's true anymore, that possibility. It feels, I'm sorry to be such a downer, but post-pandemic, I don't see that happening as a possibility anymore. Like we were faced with a global flu pandemic that killed millions of people and has possibly caused disabilities for lots of people at a scale that we don't really understand yet because it's too early. And we didn't come together in the face of this external threat as a civilization. We did quite the opposite. We divided into various camps and thought about it, and lots of people pretended it wasn't happening, or waited until it had calmed down to just go back to normal as quickly as possible, which is a very understandable reaction. I'm not accusing people of this, but it's instead of it exposing, it did expose. Right? I was talking about in the book, I'm talking about this, I'm talking about in the work on complexity that you mentioned. We have these fragilities within our society, within a civilization that can break. It might be internet failure, it might be supply chains, it might be whatever, right? COVID exposed a bunch of those, exposed how fragile supply chains were, exposed that we have put our manufacturing in, centralized it in certain parts of the world just to save costs on labor. But that's a real problem. And to the extent that, as what we like to call ourselves as a highly technological civilization, wasn't able to make enough paper masks for people at the time of the global crisis, right? Wasn't able to manufacture a vaccine quick enough and get it to enough people. People, I think, the early days of vaccine rollout were absolute nightmare if people remember, right? Like, I'm sitting here in Canada and just over the border, people going, I'm so pleased to have my vaccine. And I'm like, I haven't had one and I haven't got any idea about when I'm going to get one. And that's because the health industry, pharmaceutical industry, moved manufacturing out of Canada when Canada socialized its healthcare because they didn't see it would be profitable enough. So they moved it over to border to America, right? And things like that. It really depressed and kind of shook me up. I kind of had quite a bad time in my mental health thinking about this, watching us not have that response to external threat and to go the other way. Because that's like, we're not going to be able to deal with climate change. I don't know if people know Watchmen, you know, the Alan Moore graphic novel Watchmen. People are nodding. Big spoiler if you haven't read it. The end of that novel is about presenting a fictitious external threat to the world in order to make it unify and avoid a nuclear war. And some of the characters at the end of that book say it isn't going to work. But that and they're right. I don't think that concept works anymore. I don't think the idea that you can pull conflicting parts of our civilization, whether that's countries or communities or whatever, together with an external threat, it actually makes them more divisive, it feels. And that worries me. That really, really, really worries me. When we're talking about whether collapse is inevitable, I think that's the guiding thing. We get told we're responsible for climate change a lot, and it's greenwashing, and it is absolutely greenwashing that, you know, oh, you know, you're worried about climate change, you should take less holidays and recycle more. And actually, that's, you know, that's not the problem. The problem is large corporations consuming lots of energy. It's the market over oil and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's oil, it's natural resource extraction, mega corporations that are causing the most damage, right? But at the same time, we do need to be unified to these threats, and we do need to, as populations, we do need to understand what they are so that we can stand up and resist them when we have the opportunity to do. Whether that's voting, whether that's going on protests, whether that's rejecting a technology. Again, I'm back to AI. Sorry, it's my current everybody's obsession, including mine. But the idea that we should just reject this technology, we don't need it. And the things that it's aiming to fix, we should try and change ourselves rather than have a technological solution for them. If we don't have that, then we're getting steamrolled by it, right? Like, I just read a thing the other day. It was an advert for an ed tech company. My wife is a professor here in Toronto of futures in education technology, right? And she's her job is being very critical about this stuff. And she showed me a thing the other day. It was an AI startup for professors to help professors handle their grading and stuff. And she knows that people are already using this tech anyway. And one thing that it's advertised as is, oh, you know, you've got a class of 250 students, which isn't uncommon in US and North American universities. You know, you've got 250 students you've got to administrate. Why don't you let AI do some of that? And her reaction is like, why don't I not have a class of 250 students? Right. The problem isn't that I haven't got an AI assistant to look after them. It's like, my class size is too big by a factor of like 5, right? Do you know what I mean? It needs to be, I need to have like 50 people that I'm in charge of administrating. You need to employ another 4 people to administrate the other people. And that's the problem, right? It's the problem in higher education, isn't that you don't have AI doing jobs, you don't get paid enough, and the labor's being put on what we call adjunct workers here in the US, teaching assistants, I guess you call them in the UK. You know, these are the sort of problems. And we need to be able to, like, I want us to be able to respond to that kind of marketing as a civilization, or as populations rather, and kind of resist that stuff rather than just being steamrolled by it and saying, oh, hopefully this will fix it. It's very hard. People are busy, man. People are busy and tired. Most people are busier than me and more tired than me. And I understand that, you know, as someone that had 9-to-5 jobs for most of their life up until, like, you know, like 15 years ago, I understand what it feels like. And it's hard to get people on side to take time to think about stuff. I really do. Again, I have a naive belief that science fiction novels might do that, but who knows? Yeah.
Tim, that was honestly amazing and so interesting. Personally, I loved your take on the concept of power in America and how that's influenced by the American dream. But I just wanted to ask 2 questions.
firstly, do you have any advice for young people, especially now that the world's, you know, changing almost every day and changing immeasurably? And second is, what's your favorite sci-fi TV show or movie?
Oh my gosh. Let me do the second one first. My favorite sci-fi TV show. What's my favorite sci-fi TV show? I would gonna if I'm gonna be like a kind of obscure idiot, I would probably call her like a there'd probably some anime show that I would pull out. Something like Den Coil, which was a show that really influenced my work on augmented reality. I don't know if anybody knows that show. I don't think it picked up for streaming anywhere. It should be. It's about kids in a smart city. It's actually called the Smart City. It was a show that was made in the very early 2000s, I think around 2006. And it's about ostensibly a children's show, but it really isn't. It's about this group of kids who moved to a new smart city in Japan, and they were given these AR glasses, and about what happens to them exploring the city and how technology works and how power works in the city. And it's a really, really interesting thing. I watch a lot of Star Trek. I've only become a Star Trek fan in the last 10 years. I always hated Star Trek, but my wife is a hardcore Star Trek fan. My sister-in-law is a hardcore Star Trek fan. And they basically one Christmas strapped me to a couch and forced me to watch TNG. And I've now converted to it. And I liked the original Star Trek when I was a kid, if it was on TV. When Next Generation came, when that started in the early 90s or late 80s, I was into cyberpunk, man. I was reading the Bruce Sterling books and Gibson books, and I was reading Judge Dredd comics and like all sorts of stuff, John Carpenter movies and things like that. And I just was like, what is this? This feels so completely like irrelevant to my experience of the world and what I want science fiction to be. Um, but I've come around to it now. I understand what it's doing, especially DS9. Deep Space Nine is just, I just love DS9, man. I mean, anything that can drop quotes from the Communist Manifesto into dialogue on a regular basis, or have a two-part time travel episode where they reveal that the only reason the future utopia exists is because there was a riot in a homeless camp in San Francisco in the early 2020s. It's just like brilliant. It's just great. So I've come around to like Star Trek now. Recently, though, there's a show that's unfortunately was announced was just cancelled. It was on HBO. I don't think it's been shown in the UK. It's coming to Netflix next month, I believe, called Scavenger's Reign. It's an animated show, 10-part animated show. It is absolutely incredible. I have no idea how they got it made. It is like 5 hours of beautiful hand-drawn animation. Very, very, very influenced by Mobius, French comic artist Mobius, who's well known for his work on the early Dune concept art and his work on stuff that went on to influence Blade Runner and Alien and stuff. And he also is a direct influence on Miyazaki, who quotes him as they were friends, in fact, before Mobius died. And Miyazaki always quotes him as a major influence. And it's a show that's visually very, very, very influenced by Mobius and Miyazaki. And that's wonderful. If you can see that, it's wonderful. It's a kind of quite dark body horror show about a group of astronauts, a group of a spaceship crew that crash on a very hostile planet, where the ecosystem is very hostile. And it's beautifully made and just really, really nicely done. A vain hope that it'll be popular enough on Netflix for Netflix to fund a second season of it, because HBO are not funding the second season of it. Movies, oh man, I don't know. Blade Runner is the obvious kind of example that I always go to and I still watch regularly. I'm having a complete blank out now. Again, anime movies, Ghost in the Shell, Pat Labor 1 and 2, which are great movies about using giant robots to talk about global politics. Is always a good move, I think. So yeah, so there's a huge wealth of content there. What was your other question, man? I know there was two parts there.
Yeah. The other question was, do you have any advice for young people?
Yes and no. I think one advice is I'm very torn between people should try and understand the past and what's gone before them, and you shouldn't listen to old people too much. That's the kind of dichotomy there. So I don't know that people should be listening to me all the time. I'm just turned 50, and it's kind of like I feel like officially old now. And I don't know that young people should always be listening to me. But on a broader sense, one of the things we've discussed about be open to criticism, understand critical thinking. I'm always inspired by young people, man. I was inspired by the climate marches and Greta Thunberg and all that stuff. I was inspired by Black Lives Matter. I'm inspired now by the encampments in the US on US campuses against, ethnic cleansing in Gaza. And, to see these kids stand up and say, be interviewed by journalists and say, well, you might not be able to finish your degree. You might, there's more important things to my degree. It's very inspiring to me. It's very inspiring to me to see past the structures that are being presented to them. Right. Do you know what I mean? Like I say, I'm older. I went to university in 1992. I was the first person in my family on both sides to go to university. I came from like sort of very working class families on both sides. My parents were not given the opportunity. My dad actually was given the opportunity to go to university, and his parents wouldn't let him. And my mum, it was just never a possibility, but something that I think they both really wanted to do. So they were very insistent on me going to university, which was great. But I think it's changed now. What I'm saying is when I was 18, it was still an option, right? Do you go to university? Do you not go to university? For now, for a huge amount of people, especially in the US, it's not an option anymore. You've got to go. There's no getting out of it. The structure's presented to you. If you don't fulfill that structure and become part of that process, you're not going to get the life that you want afterwards. You're maybe not going to get the life that you want afterwards anyway. It's the bullshit, right? That's the thing about that. Like, you can come out of university with a great degree, you can go into a reasonably well-paid job, and if you live in a city like this, there's no way you can buy a house, right? It's just not a possibility to do that. Plus, you've got climate change breathing down your neck, right? Do you know what I mean? And it's easy for me at 50 years old to worry about what life is going to be like in 2050, because I'm either going to be dead or in a retirement home or something, right? Do you know what I mean? But for people your age, for you guys, for young people, that's a reality that you guys need to be thinking about really hard, right? You're going to be like, roughly my age, I'm guessing, yeah, in 2050, and the models that are coming out for 2050 are bad, man. They're really bad. So I'm not here to be a downer about your future. Suddenly realize this is just maybe I should read the room and not say this, but if you go and look at the climate models, things don't look great. They don't look great for 20 years time. So it's good to see young people being aware of that, being able to see past the models they've given, to understand that phrase that, a better world is possible, to understand what that actually means. It means that, we're not limited. Capitalism isn't the natural order, right? Free markets aren't the natural order. We've been told they are by American exceptionalism for like 100 years, but that's not the truth. We can find other ways of building, and I don't necessarily mean communism. I'm not talking about a kind of team sport battle between two ideologies. I'm thinking about, actually looking past the structures and wondering that I'm speculating about finding something else. Problem is, we are short time, right? These things, phrase that I've found myself using a lot is that I feel we are definitely short time. And when I see people get upset about them throwing paint on a painting in a gallery, and I used to work as an art critic, man. I go to galleries all the time. It's one of my main social activities, is going to see art. And I absolutely support people that throw paint at paintings. Absolutely, 100%, because it's not fucking important. The scale of millions of people dying through flood and famine, right? And doing an act like that, I think, really reveals that in interesting ways. It's interesting to see that stuff coming out. It's interesting to see young people noticing that. And I guess the little advice is to lean into that, be questioning all the time. You've got to be quick, and you have to act on things quickly. And that's the concern. Your life I'm such an old bastard, but like when I was your guys' age, you know, it looked like my life was infinite, and it catches up to you pretty quick. Things move pretty fast. So, you know, those couple of decades until things get really bad with climate changes, we need to act before that happens. They'll come pretty quickly. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but you get my point. I think.
Well, I think we're going to draw to a close, Tim. Thank you so much for a fascinating, rich, mind-expanding conversation. We really appreciate your time, all of your insights. And I think that is a good note to end on, right? Is to look out onto the world and to see what is out there to be inspired by. And indeed, I also find a lot of inspiration in younger people, and younger people really
Absolutely.
questioning the legacy that they have inherited. And, you know, what perhaps we want to salvage from that legacy, and what perhaps we also need to let go.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for having me, man. This has been great.
Thanks for tuning in to Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. If you liked this content, please do leave us a comment and subscribe. If you're new to the show and you want to get a list of our favorite books, other resources, listen to past shows, and to join our community, go to ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.